I'm glad you all made it here. I know there's a lot of fantastic talks going on right now, concurrent with this one, and so I do appreciate you being here. I also know that Apple's got their big announcement today, and I know it's going to be a hard one to miss. I'll give you a preview of it. It looks a little like this, I think, only bigger is what I hear. I don't know. It's going to be a little something like that. So we're going to talk today about Spring Social, but before we get started, what I want to give you is a little bit of, a little groundwork, a little bit of stuff to consider. First off, this talk is going to go super fast if you don't ask any questions. A lot of people like to save the question and answer period to the end of the talk. I would actually prefer you interrupt me if you have a question. The best time to ask a question is when you have it. And I would like to get through all these slides, but I am under no obligation to do so. So I would rather answer your questions than to get through everything we have here today. So please interrupt me. I will do my best to answer you when you have your question. The worst I can say is hold off. I'm going to answer that here in a minute, or I just simply don't know is probably the worst case scenario, but at least I'll give you an honest answer. All right, so really quick show of hands. How many of you have used Spring Social before? Okay, and the rest of you are all new to it, I can assume. Either that or you just don't like raising your hands. I've been the project lead for Spring Social for about 4 years or so, and which is a very interesting thing for me because I, like probably some of you, am somewhat of an introvert, so the idea of social stuff felt foreign to me. But nevertheless, it's a fantastic and fun project, and hope you'll get a lot out of this today. This is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, first off, just social applications. What does it mean to build a social app, and why should you even care? We're going to talk about what it means to work with APIs, different public APIs out there, and specifically the security around them and the challenges involved in that. And we're going to talk about where Spring Social fits into that. And then we're going to get into the details. That's when we're getting to the code, and we're going to start seeing how do you actually use Spring Social to build these apps. And then finally, I have some final thoughts I want to share with you, things about what we might do with Spring Social going forward, and also how you might get involved. So, why should you care? Why do we build applications that interact with social networks? Well, there's a lot of statistics out there, and I chose not to put everything on a big slide. I just picked out a few that I thought were interesting. Apparently, the vast majority of adult users on the internet use some sort of social networking site, whether it be Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or what have you. Facebook specifically, last count that was published, has 1.32 billion active users each month. That's active users, that's not counting the people who just passively occasionally check on Facebook and aren't really using it. That's 1.32 billion people. If you could capture for your product or your service just a fraction of that, you're winning. And already we see this. A lot of sites out there, a lot of services out there, they integrate somehow with Facebook, integrate with Twitter, and they do what they can to get those people who are following them or liking them on these networks to buy their products, buy their services, build loyalty. Many of the web applications, and you've probably seen this, they use social sign-on. They allow you to sign into their application using their Facebook credentials, using their Twitter credentials. I know that Spring.io, our website, Spring.io, our website, if I wanted to get inside to our back office area to publish a blog, I would have to log in using GitHub. So I would click on the login with GitHub, and it would use my GitHub credentials. And then by working with these social networks, you build loyalty, you build trust, and ultimately that results in customers and people who might actually give you money, which would be awesome. Just at a comparison, I'm still shocked at how different it is, but Facebook is still clearly the winner, despite the fact that there's been sort of a falling out with people not trusting Facebook lately. But Facebook is still clearly the big winner here. I'm very surprised at Google Plus's numbers, except when you consider that Google Plus is sort of secretly engaging users, even if they don't realize they're Google Plus users. Because if you're a Google Apps user, if you're a Google user and you've ever logged into Google for any purpose, you're essentially counted among those users. Instagram, interestingly enough, Instagram and I think it was Twitter are the two most active set of users. People are very engaged on those two networks, more so than the others. Instagram has a smaller number of users, but there's everyone who is using Instagram is excited about whatever they're seeing on there, and they're posting likes to pictures and photos of their vacation, and selfies probably became a thing because of Instagram. Then there's Twitter and LinkedIn. We obviously use Twitter. I'm sure a lot of you do. And LinkedIn, you know what that's for, right? That's so you can post your resume and so that recruiters can spam you. That's primarily what it's good for. Good news is, if you're a recruiter, you can build an application that spams your people. So just at a show of hands, just so we can see how accurate this chart is with regard to this demographic here, how many of you are Facebook users? Yeah, that's about right. How many of you are Google Plus users? That's about right. How about Instagram? I'm sorry? Actually use it. How about Instagram? All right. This is working out really well so far. How about Twitter? That seems about right. And LinkedIn? Now that's a little higher than this shows, but understood a little bit considering that we're all professionals here. We probably keep our LinkedIn profile updated. So that's pretty accurate. How many of you have a significant other who's a big Facebook user? Probably bigger than you. Yeah, that's me. All right. So it's pretty accurate. So why should it matter? Well, because if you're working with these, first off, you can inject your product, your service, your website, your whatever it is into your user's social graph, into your customer social graph. And one of the ways that you can do that is just very simple. A lot of companies do this. You've seen this. You've probably done it yourself. You click the like button and you say, I like this thing. I like this album. I like this movie. I've read this book. And consequently, now that product is part of your user's social graph. And when you think of the social graph, it's the user, and they're linked to their friends, but they're also linked to the things that they like, or they've read, or they've listened to, or they've watched. And using that information, you can find out about them. You can find out more about a person from their Facebook account and what they've liked and listened to and what have you than you could ever get by standing people in a mall with a clipboard doing a survey. In fact, I still see occasionally those people doing those surveys, and I just wonder, why are you bothering? Just get their Facebook account and they'll tell you more about themselves than you could ever get from that. And you can take that and turn it around and start marketing to them, interesting them in something else. In fact, I don't remember the exact statistic, and I tried to find it and I couldn't find it, but there is a high percentage, the number I will not give you because I don't remember, but there is a high percentage of people who say that are more willing to go buy an album or go see a movie if their friends have also liked it or have seen it. They trust their friends' word of mouth. It used to be the case where your neighbor would say, hey, have you listened to this, or have you bought this product? And you'd use their word of mouth as a recommendation. And although that still happens, people are more interested now in what their Facebook friends say. And I'm guilty of it too. I'll look at something on Facebook and I'll see that a friend has listened to something or seen a movie, and I'll be suddenly more interested in doing that myself. And then social sign-on. The funny thing about social sign-on is people will trust your application more with their security if you let them sign in with Facebook or let them sign in with Twitter or some other site like this. And it's kind of ironic considering the security around that is good, but probably a little less than what you would get if you had built your own security mechanism yourself. Nevertheless, people trust that. They are more likely to sign on to your site using Facebook than they are to actually go fill in a form and enter their username and password on your site. And then social customer service. This is one that has been around for a while. It's not a new thing. I got two stories to tell about this. One's personal and one I saw on the news just recently. Here in Dallas a few weeks ago, I saw on the news that Southwest Airlines, aside from all the else, they're branching out to other locations because the Wright Amendment's going away. They're changing, as of yesterday, they're changing their look, so they're going to look entirely different. But a few weeks ago, the big news for me was they opened up this entire social customer service center, and they showed it on the news. It looked like NASA. And literally, it's a bunch of Southwest Airlines employees sitting around reading Facebook and Twitter, looking for messages about Southwest Airlines so they can address concerns that Southwest customers have, and maybe even address some praises. If someone said good things about Southwest Airlines, they can respond appropriately that way. And it's not just Southwest Airlines that's doing this. It's actually quite a trend going on. I've seen it happen several other places, but Southwest is the one I've seen most recently on the news. Personally, one of my favorite stories, I usually tell this story every year, and I'm going to encourage everyone to listen to this and act on it yourself if you want to. A few years ago, I was watching the TV around the end of the year, and they have the big end of year clearance sales. And so a certain mattress company was advertising their year-end clearance. And if you say year-end fast enough, it sounds like urine. And they were having a mattress urine clearance sale as far as what I heard. And I thought to myself, I don't really care how good a deal you're making. I'm not going to buy a urine clearance mattress. So I actually tweeted that thinking I was being clever and funny. Turned out that company responded on Twitter and said, oh, duly noted, we'll fix that next year. Well, they didn't. So I'm going to do it again this year. Every year I'm going to tweet that until they fix it. So it's still just change it to end of year. It doesn't sound as bad. But at least they responded. I thought that was pretty cool. However, none of that really matters because social is not really the point. We're not talking about whether you can become friends with your customers. That's a good thing because it builds loyalty, but that's not what this talk is about. And it's not about whether or not you can get them to engage and like your product. That's not what it's about. It's about connecting versus social. I like to point out to people, because a lot of people think when they come to Spring Social that it's all about Facebook and it's all about Twitter and LinkedIn. And it's an unfortunate thing. Spring Social is a good name because it attracts attention, but it's also a bad name in the sense that it kind of implies something that's not necessarily true. There are just as many APIs out there that have nothing to do with social networks. In fact, probably more so than there are social APIs. And those APIs, you work with them and you connect with them in the same way as you would Facebook, in the same way as you would Twitter. It's about working with your APIs and connecting to their APIs and doing so on behalf of your user. That's the key here. So we're going to talk about what it means to work with those APIs and some adventures in API security. Now, I can't remember the time slot. I meant to go look it up and put it on the slides, but I know that later this week, I believe it's tomorrow. In fact, I'm willing to wager that it's tomorrow afternoon. I think Dave Sire is going to talk about securing an API using Spring Security for OAuth. And that's a great talk to go to if you want to hear about how to make your API secure. I'm going to focus on the client side of things and how to consume one of those APIs using Spring Social. So these APIs, they're secured a number of ways, and I've looked at so many APIs, literally hundreds I've probably examined at one time or another, and they're secured in a variety of ways. One is just HTTP basic authentication. That's one way. It's a really bad way, but it's a way that some of these APIs are secured. Twitter used to be secured this way up until a few years ago, and then they switched. But essentially, you get your users' credentials, and you encrypt them, and on every single request, you include that in the request in a header. Very basic. Now, here's the gotcha with that. For an application to consume an API on behalf of a user, they have to have the user's credentials. The thing that, the username, the password, the thing that you're told never to share with anyone, you have to share it with this application so that they can consume your data. This is slightly dangerous when you think about it, because now your credentials are being stored somewhere, potentially unsecure, and that's assuming you trust the application that's consuming this API. If you don't trust them, there's a potential that they could do anything and everything up to and including changing your password and then wreaking havoc on your social life on Facebook. I know that's probably the top concern for everybody, but it could happen if Facebook or whoever were secured with HTTP basic. Thankfully, there's a lot less of these today than there were a few years ago. There's still some though. Then there's application keys. These are common for applications that are not being for APIs that are not being consumed on behalf of a user. A good example of this that comes to mind immediately is Weather Underground. There's really no need to consume a weather API on behalf of an individual user because it's not that user's weather. It's not like my weather is any different than anyone here's weather. We're all in the same location, so the weather is going to be more or less the same. So Weather Underground uses an application key, and that's a good way of doing it for that class of API. But more often, we're dealing with APIs that are serving up user-specific data. It's my Facebook profile. It's my Twitter profile. It's my, to go with a non-social example, it's my QuickBooks Online data. In those cases, we need something different. And some of them have gone off and created their own homegrown authentication schemes. And these are the scariest of them all, because you don't know if they're really secure. You can't really trust it unless you're a security expert and have the time to go analyze what they've done. You can't really trust if they're truly secure. And there's no libraries probably to help you deal with them. But that's where OAuth comes in. And the vast majority of APIs out there, especially those that are serving up user-specific data, are secured with OAuth, either OAuth 1, 1.0a, or OAuth 2. I'm going to focus on OAuth 1 and 1.0a and OAuth 2 bearer tokens. But I want you to know that there's another type of OAuth that is not talked about as much. It's the OAuth 2 MAC tokens. I'm going to talk about it really quickly just so you're aware of it. But I have no APIs I can refer to and say, here's how they do it, because I'm sure there are APIs using MAC tokens. I have just never, ever seen them. OAuth 2 MAC tokens, in short, are more secure than bearer tokens. The word bearer is significant with bearer token. It means if you have, we're going to talk about how to get an access token to consume an API. If you have the token, it's as good as being the application, whether you're the one who got the token or you're the one who stole the token from someone. Either way, you bear the token, you can access the API as if you were the application who was given the authority to do so in the first place. MAC tokens are a little different. MAC tokens are actually more like what OAuth 1 offers, except vastly simpler. I'm going to go ahead and just go out on a limb here, and some people might, rake me over the coals for this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. If you're building an application like Facebook or Twitter, and you're worried about someone, you want someone to consume your API, bearer tokens are probably, and I hate to use this phrase, but I'm going to say it anyway, secure enough. Worst case scenario, someone steals the bearer token and posts something questionable about you on Facebook, and you have to somehow apologize to your mom about that, right? It's not going to wipe you out. It's not going to kill you, wipe you out financially or anything like that. It's just going to be embarrassing and inconvenient at the worst case. So perhaps it's secure enough, assuming that the client and the server are both working together to make sure that the bearer tokens are as secure as they can be. However, if you're dealing with a banking API, if you're dealing with my money, you probably want to consider MAC tokens. That said, I'm going to focus on those other two because, again, I don't have any APIs, any public APIs I'm aware of that use MAC tokens. Therefore, Spring Social doesn't yet support them simply because I know of no API that does that uses them. I'm sure they exist. I just don't know of them. So here's the easy slide. This is going to tell you roughly what OAuth does. It gets scarier over the next few slides, and then I'm going to make it better on you. First off, let's just say that the Spring.io website did this. It doesn't, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it wanted to get a list of my friends. It would go on off and ask the service over here, perhaps Facebook, perhaps Twitter, whatever, may I have a list of Craig's friends? And the service is going to reply by saying, well, Craig, Spring.io wants to see your list of friends. Is that cool with you? Are you okay with that? And I'm pretty much gullible and will do anything. So yeah, sure, I guess that's okay. And then now that I have told the API that, I have logged into the API or logged into Facebook or logged into Twitter and told them, yes, it's okay. Now, it tells the application here, yeah, Craig says that's okay. Here's a token you can use to access his information. This access token that the application is given represents a three-way relationship, a three-way agreement between the user, the API, and the application. That token is only good for that application, it's only good for that user, and it's only good for that API. So it's a three-way agreement, and now that can use it. Now that's the friendly, easy slide. It gets scarier. This is how it's done more specifically with OAuth. The first thing that happens is the client redirects to the API's authorization page. So the browser gets redirected. You suddenly see something pop up that says, hey, is it okay if I access your friends? On Facebook, it might look a little something like this. And if you say OK, well, the rest of this flow is going to go on. If you say cancel, then an error situation happens, and we tell the client, sorry, you're out of luck. Or some APIs don't even go that far. Some APIs don't even tell the client no. They just simply say, they just stop. They don't even redirect back. If you said you don't trust the client, then we're not even going to take you back there. But per the spec and most APIs, they will redirect back to the client. And when they redirect back to the client, they're going to redirect back with an authorization code. And then the client can take that authorization code and via a backend, a server-to-server REST call, it can exchange that authorization code along with its own client ID and secret and some encryption along the way. It can exchange that for an access token. And now that it has an access token, it can use that token on every single request it makes for, as long as that token's good, as long as the user hasn't revoked the token, as long as the token hasn't expired, we're good. Now, how you use that token, we'll get back to that. I need to talk a little bit about OAuth 1. It's a little different. It's similar to that, but a little different. The first thing we do is we start off by asking for a request token. That's a server-to-server call to get a request token. Once we have the request token, well, it's pretty much the same after that. We use that request token as a means of encrypting all the communication from here on out. And we go ahead and redirect. We ask for their permission. The user says yes. We redirect back with what's called a verifier, but it's essentially the same as an OAuth 2 authorization code. And then that is exchanged for an access token, and we use that from here on out. So it's a little more difficult. The big difference between OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 is that is the request token. And the reason it existed is to encrypt the messages in the dance. And with OAuth 2, they sort of realized, you know what? HTTPS does a decent job of that, so we're going to go ahead and just trust that. Now, yeah, I know there's people breaking HTTPS these days, but that was the decision that was made with OAuth 2, is we'll just let HTTPS do the encryption. We don't need to encrypt it yet again. And this is all you have to do with OAuth 2 to use that access token, is you add an authorization header to every single request with the word bearer followed by whatever the token is. And so now I can take and pass that, make a request for a user's friends, make a request for a user's profile, and as long as that token that I'm passing is good, I'm going to get that information. Optionally, it can be sent in an access token parameter, but it's not really suggested you do that. The better thing is to put it in the header. With OAuth 1, it's a little trickier, and there's a reason I'm showing you this scary slide, so bear with me. First off, we take all the query parameters and we sort them. We append them to the base URL along with the HTTP method. So we create this big concatenated method ampersand URL ampersand the sorted and encoded parameters. Once we have that, we have a thing called the base string. This is the part where you should be freaking out and thinking, why did I come to this talk? Because this is getting scary. Hold on, it'll get better. And then you encrypt it. Now you have some options here. You can either not encrypt it by using plain text. You can use RSA SHA-1. The spec allows for both of those, but I know of nobody who implements either of those. Plain text is not secure enough. RSA SHA-1 is a little too secure for most applications. HMAC SHA-1 is what is commonly used. You encrypt that using your client's credentials as the encryption key, and now you have what's known as the signature. And so then you add this header to this authorization header to every single request. And it has to be calculated on every single request because you have to calculate the signature for that request. You have to have a nonce, a once and only once value. You have to have your timestamp. You have to have a whole bunch of stuff that is specific to that request to canonicalize the request. And then you just panic because this is just too freaking hard. The good news is, well, I'll come back to the good news. The good news is, don't worry too much about that. It's not that scary. But as an API client, you have these responsibilities. You have to obtain those access tokens using the mechanism I just showed you. You have to securely store those access tokens in a database or somewhere where nobody's going to get them because, especially with OAuth 2, it's a bearer token. Whoever bears that token can access the API. So if someone were to get a hold of it, you might as well have given them the user's username and password. You include that authorization header on all your API requests, and then when those tokens expire or get revoked, it's on you to make sure you get a brand new token. But again, that's not really your problem. It is your problem unless you're using Spring Social. So that's where Spring Social comes in, is it takes care of all of that for you. One of the cool things about Spring Social is, unlike a lot of other OAuth libraries out there, Spring Social doesn't require you to understand anything I just told you. You don't have to understand OAuth. You can, and it's useful to understand it so you know what's going on, but you can actually make use of it without knowing jack squat about OAuth. All you need to do is register your application with the client, with the server. So like with Facebook or Twitter, you go into the development area, you answer some questions, and they give you your client's credentials. You register those client credentials within your application, and Spring Social takes care of the rest for you. You don't need to know about any of the stuff I just told you. So here's the Spring Social project family in a nutshell. Spring Social is made up of several projects. At its very base, we have the main project, which offers 4 main modules. There's the core module, which defines how we are going to produce these tokens, how we're going to save these tokens, how we're going to calculate these requests, whatever. Then there's the security module. This is specifically for if you're using Spring Social along with Spring Security. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. You don't have to use Spring Social with Spring Security, but if you are, there's some good stuff you can get out of that module. Then there's the web module. The web module is where all this redirection in your browser takes place. There's a controller, several controllers in there that deal with this redirection for you, and it works with the core to obtain and save these tokens and then use them for long-term use as you consume the API. And then there's the configuration module, which is relatively new. It enables you to do, it's just basically a Java configuration and XML configuration support. I should also mention it's not strictly part of the same project, but Spring for Android is another project we have. Spring for Android, among other things, enables you to use Spring Social from an Android device. And then there's the different API provider bindings. Technically speaking, we, and by we I mean me, support these 5 bindings: Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn primarily. Those are the ones that have been given the most attention. GitHub is getting more attention. In fact, I'm getting a number of questions about, when's GitHub going to be kind of finished up. So that's one of the things I'd like to get ready pretty soon. But certainly Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and TripIt. TripIt exists. I'm just going to go ahead and toss this out there. TripIt has a question mark beside it. The reason we have that module in the first place, the reason we even bothered with TripIt, is not because we're terribly excited about TripIt. I mean, it's great and all, but it's not because we wanted to support TripIt. It's because in the early days of Spring Social, TripIt's OAuth implementation exhibited some peculiarities that made it interesting for us. And so we wanted to make sure that Spring Social could deal with that. So we added it to our set of potential client API bindings we could work with. Turns out that changed over time. It's not really presenting any interesting peculiarities anymore, and it never has gotten a whole lot of love. And so I'll be quite honest with you, I would invite anyone who wants to come along and just run with that. It'd be awesome. If you're excited about TripIt integration, run with it. It's kind of under our umbrella, but I'm just going to probably not do much with it in the near term anyway. And then there's the community-led projects. There are, gosh, I think the 28 community-led projects. I don't keep track of these. I don't code to these. I occasionally help out. I occasionally submit a pull request to them to help them out. But these are just people who have stepped up and said, yeah, I think I'm gonna build a API binding and connection support for Spring Social. And they've stepped up and offered this stuff. Now, I don't know if all of these are current. I have no idea if everyone who's working on these, as tends to happen sometimes in the community, they kind of get busy with other stuff and they're not working on it anymore. So I don't know if these are all current, but they do all exist. And so if you're wanting to interact with any of those, here's an opportunity. I would like to point out a few of them, though. There's Khan Academy, which is arguably not really a social API. There's Intuit's QuickBooks Online. That's not a social API. I typically don't share my financial details with my friends, so I don't really consider that a social API. There's Salesforce, again, not a social API. So just stressing the point again that even though the project's called Spring Social, it's really more about making connections with these APIs on behalf of your users. All right. Here's how Spring Social works. Here's the various basic components of Spring Social. First off, we have a ConnectController. ConnectController's job is to do that OAuth dance. Everything I showed you a few slides ago, its job is to make sure that the browser gets redirected. Once it's there and the user has said, yes, I will accept this, it's to handle the callback, the redirect back. And it's going to hand off to some of these other components to do the real work, to go get the tokens and save them. There's a connection factory locator. Well, its job is, as its name suggests, is just to locate connection factories. Now, what's a connection factory? Well, connection factory's job is to create connections. And essentially the way this works is the ConnectController will be given a URL whose path contains a provider ID in it. So Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, these are the provider IDs. ConnectController is going to ask Connection Factory Locator for the connection factory that matches that ID. The Connection Factory knows everything there is to know about talking to Facebook or talking to LinkedIn to get this connection to work, to get this redirect to work. So the ConnectController, aside from creating connections, Connection Factory also informs ConnectController where to redirect to do this. Once you have the access token, Connection Repository is where it's going to store it securely for future use, so that when you inject a API binding into your code, you can just make calls to it directly and not worry yourselves with the access token. You never have to worry about actually dealing with the access token directly. The API binding is injected to wherever you need to use it. It will know who the user is, it will know what their access token is, and it will make sure that that token is placed on every single request that it makes. So just to kind of give you an idea of how ConnectController works, here's its flow. Let's just say you're in Spring Social Showcase, which is a little example app that I'll show you a little bit later. I usually talk through this when I show the example, but I realize that it goes a little fast, so I'm going to slow it down on these slides. First off, you can go into the application and go to /connect. What /connect is going to offer you is just the status page for all the API bindings it knows about. In this case, it knows about Twitter, it knows about LinkedIn, it knows about Facebook. If I added GitHub to the mix, if I added Viadeo to the mix, whatever, it's going to know about those as well, and those will be listed here too. This list is produced basically on what connection factories are registered with the application. So it knows that it knows about Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, but it also knows that the current user is not connected to any of them. So it says you're not connected to Twitter, you're not connected to LinkedIn, you're not connected to Facebook. And so it gives you an opportunity to do that. If you click on the Here button, or if you just went to it through other means, if you connect to it directly, you're going to be going to /connect/ whatever the ID is, /connect/ Twitter, it's a GET request, it's going to show you the status page for that individual item. Now, when I say the status page, essentially all the ConnectController does is get the status information for those connections and make it available to a view, to a Spring MVC view. It's up to you to provide the view. As of Spring Social 1.1, we do have a very default basic view. I'll show you that one a little bit later too. It's boring and you're never going to want to use it. It's there primarily as a starting point. It's kind of like if you've ever used Spring Security, it'll give you a basic web-based login page, but you never want to use that one because it's boring. Times Roman, black on white background, you're not going to use it. But it's there to get you started. You're going to want to provide your own status views, whether it's in JSP or Timeleaf or however you want to do it. But /connect/ Twitter is going to show you, hey, you're not connected, I don't have any connections to Twitter yet, but you can click this button to make that. This is not the basic one. This is one that's part of Spring Social Showcase. This is a JSP page. No, actually, this is a Timeleaf page behind the scenes. And it shows you what that is, what your connection status is. And by clicking that button, you initiate the connection flow. It starts a post. It does a post request to the ConnectController. So it's post /connect/ Twitter. That triggers the ConnectController to do one or two things depending on what kind of provider we're dealing with. If this is an OAuth 1 provider, such as Twitter, Twitter is OAuth 1.0a based. If it's a 1.0 provider, it's going to, before we ever do this redirect, it's going to go off and fetch the request token behind the scenes and get the request token ready to go. And then it's going to redirect to the authorization page, at which point the user has a chance to say, yes, I authorize that. And then Twitter is going to redirect back to the application at /connect/Twitter with a GET request, /connect/Twitter and OAuth token. So it's going to tell you what the OAuth request token is. At this point, it's not the real access token, it's the request token and the verifier. So whatever the authorization code or verifier is, it's going to send it back. If this was an OAuth 2 provider, the only big difference is you wouldn't have the OAuth token parameter there, and instead of verifier, it would be code instead of verifier. But it's going to have the authorization code. It's going to go back to the application, at which point the application now has a connection to Twitter. Behind the scenes, ConnectController has now worked with the connection repository, save that to the database. And again, a connection is essentially who's the user, what API are we talking about, and what's their access token, and some other information that might be useful in reestablishing connections later on. But that's it. And now you're connected, and if I were to go to my profile page on Spring Social Showcase, it knows who I am at Twitter. Now here's the important thing, and I felt the need to put this slide in because in the last few weeks I've gotten more than one question about this. People say, how do I close these connections? And the answer is, what do you mean? Close. You don't close the connections. Connections are not like JDBC connections. They're not like that kind of thing where you want to, after you're done with them, you close them. They are more of a concept of who's the user, who's the API, and how are we going to talk to them. And so they're stored in the database. You don't want to close them if you can avoid it, because that's how you're going to talk with the API. So don't think of them in the same way you'd think of as a JDBC connection, that you want to close as soon as you're done working with it. You want to kind of keep them around in the database for future use. So there's a few other pieces of this puzzle that I haven't really shown you. There's provider sign-in controller. Provider sign-in controller does almost the exact same flow as ConnectController, but in the end, instead of creating a connection, it signs you in to the application. And it works with a provider sign-in adapter. And so there's an interface you can implement, and so the thinking is no matter what your security scheme is for your application, the provider sign-in adapter, its job is to actually authenticate the user into the application. Provider sign-in controller will work with that. So what it's going to do is it's going to redirect to the provider, it's going to redirect back, it's going to figure out who the user is, and it's going to turn around and ask, the API, who is this? What's their unique identifying information? So for like Facebook, it would be their Facebook ID. For Twitter, it's their Twitter user ID. And that's going to be the thing that uniquely identifies them. And it's going to turn around after that and it's going to say, okay, do I have a connection anywhere in my connection repository? Do I have a connection whose ID matches this ID? If I do, I'm going to go ahead and automatically sign that user in. The thinking being, whoever has gone through this process with Facebook or Twitter or GitHub or whoever, the thinking being is by the time they get done with that, we can pretty much feel confident that that is, in fact, who the user is. This is not that terribly, groundbreaking. Facebook and Twitter, and I think LinkedIn, offer this out of the box. They offer a JavaScript-based implementation of this out of the box. But provider sign-in controller does it for pretty much any API you can think of. Any API that has an OAuth authorization scheme, you can use to do this pseudo authentication. And if you've ever heard of something called OpenID Connect, this is essentially the same process as OpenID Connect. The only key difference being OpenID Connect has sort of formalized exactly what that API is going to look like, whereas with Facebook and Twitter, it's kind of up to Facebook and Twitter to decide what that API looks like. Now this is really good if you're not using Spring Security. Now if you are using Spring Security as your application security mechanism, you can use this. You can use Provider Sign-in Controller, but it's not the best choice. Because Provider Sign-in Controller doesn't really inject itself into Spring Security's filters, into its filter chain. It's just going to get you logged in, and it's up to you to work with Spring Security to make sure all the other goodies that Spring Security offers, such as Remember Me and whatever else, happen to work with this. So this is great if you're using something other than Spring Security. But if you are using Spring Security, you should use Social Authentication Filter. This is a proper Spring Social Authentication Filter implementation. It works no different than if, as far at least from an API point of view, it works no different than if you were using any of the other security authentication filters. And therefore, it fits right into the security chain, and you can take advantage of all the other features of Spring Security when you do this. So this is definitely best suited for when you are using Spring Security. And then there's some other stuff, miscellaneous things that are worth talking about. There's a reconnect filter that was added in Spring Social 1.1. Prior to Spring Social 1.1, if you're working, you have your connection, you have your token, you're making an API call, and somewhere between the time you got the token and the time that you want to use it, the token has expired, or the token has been revoked by the user, or for whatever reason, the token is no good anymore. It's not going to work for you. Well, prior to Spring Social 1.1, that would have been your problem. You'd have got an exception, and you would have had to handle that somehow. With Spring Social 1.1, we have this filter that will catch that exception, and it's essentially going to redirect to ConnectController. And ConnectController is going to go back through its steps to get a new connection, and now you should be able to pick up where you left off and make the request that you couldn't make before. Now this is a little different if you're familiar with how OAuth 2 refresh tokens work. With OAuth 2 OAuth 2, you're supposed to be given a refresh token. And whenever you get an access token, you're supposed to also get a refresh token, and then you can take that refresh token and you can exchange it for a brand new access token. The gotcha there is Facebook, LinkedIn, and many other APIs who implement OAuth 2 don't implement that part of OAuth 2. And for the longest time, I was angry with them for doing that, because I'm like, why aren't you doing what the spec says you should do? And it occurred to me why they're doing it. It's actually more secure, because if an application has an access token and an access token is going to expire, and then the application can turn around and simply use the refresh token to get a brand new access token, that requires no user involvement. The user can step away and never use your application again, and yet your application can turn around and keep refreshing its token all day long and doing whatever it wants to on behalf of the user. But with a reconnect, the user actually has to be using your app, because the browser has to be up and the user has to be logged in for this to even work. It can't do it any other way. So that's why Facebook and LinkedIn and others are not implementing the refresh token. They're doing it by forcing a reconnect, or sorry, enforcing a brand new connection flow. There's also a disconnect controller that's part of the Facebook project. What this allows you to do is it allows you to react to the user disconnecting your app. So typically, if you want to revoke an access token, you can go out to Facebook and go out to Twitter, and you go into the security settings and you say, nope, I don't want this app around anymore on Facebook. But then your application would never know about that. Your application, as far as it knows, that connection still exists, and things may not work anymore. So what Disconnect Controller does is Facebook allows you to go set up a disconnect URL such that when the user disconnects you at Facebook, they will turn around and call your URL, your essentially what Disconnect Controller is going to be reacting to. They will call that and tell you, hey, this user has turned you off. You need to go clean up your database, clean out your access tokens. They don't exist anymore as far as you're concerned. There's also a real-time update controller. Now, Spring Social Twitter 1.1 introduced the streaming API, so you can work with Twitter's streaming API to get updates as they come in. But that's different than the way Facebook does it. The way Facebook does it is they actually allow you to set up a URL such that they can call you whenever updates come in. They actually just do they do post requests to you to tell you when updates come in. And so real-time update controller handles Facebook-style real-time updates. The only downside of that, the way they've implemented it is kind of goofy. For security reasons, it's kind of weird to deal with. They don't actually tell you tell you the details of what's been updated. So if you're you want to get updates on when someone posts something to their wall on Facebook, you're not going to get the actual message that they posted. What you're going to get is who the user is, what the ID is of the post, and then you have to turn around and call the API to ask for the details of that. They're not going to tell you everything about it. They're just going to tell you, hey, here's something new you might want to go check into. And then finally, Spring Social 1.1 also added these generic OAuth 1 connection factory and generic OAuth 2 connection factories. Most connection factories are hardwired to work with Facebook, hardwired to work with GitHub, hardwired to work with LinkedIn and Twitter. And they know everything there is to know about that, so you don't have to configure them. You just set them up, you make sure they're registered, and it just works. They have their and when you ask for the API binding from them, they give you the Facebook interface, an implementation of the Facebook interface, so they give you an implementation of the Twitter interface. These guys are for those situations where Spring Social does not yet have support for the API you're working with. There's a little more configuration involved to get these to work, but you tell them, here's where the authorization page is, here's where the redirect page is, here's where they can go get the access token for. You tell them everything about your API. The things that are typically hardwired in most of the connection factories, you go configure these explicitly. And when you ask for the API binding you get is just going to be REST operations, a Spring REST template. And so it allows you to work with the API using just plain old REST template. The good news is that REST template has been instrumented to make sure that the access token is going to be on every single request you make. So you still don't have to worry about OAuth. You're going to get a ready-to-go, OAuth-ready REST template from them. All right. Now here's where we get to the details. Here's how we build an application with Spring Social. And I'm going to show you a few scary slides first. It's kind of a theme in this talk. I show you scary stuff first, and then I lighten the mood a little bit. So here's all the things you're going to need. You're going to want to be able to configure ConnectController. You're going to make sure the controller is there. You're going to want to make sure that you have the connection factory locator configured. You're going to need, along with the connection factory locator, you're going to need one or more connection factories depending on what APIs you're working with. You're going to need a connection repository. And by the way, there's two of those. There's the connection repository, and then there's the users. Actually, there's supposed to be an S there. The users connection repository. The users connection repository is kind of a generic one. It knows how, it's actually a better name for it is connection repository factory, because it creates connection repositories for whoever the current user is. Meanwhile, connection repository is a request scoped bean. It has to be request scoped for it to work because it has to know who the current user is. You have the API bindings. You have to configure those. By the way, those are also going to be request scoped so that they're associated with whoever the user is that's making the request. There's provider sign-in controller. There's social authentication filter if you're either one of those if you're wanting to provide social sign-on. There's a user ID source. This is how we know who the user is. So you have to create a bean of type user ID source so that the user connection repository knows who it's creating a connection repository for. You optionally might have the reconnect controller if you're dealing with Facebook. You if you want to deal with reconnects, you optionally would have the disconnect controller if you're dealing with Facebook. And then there's other things that you might be interested in as well. So this creates a lot of configuration. In fact, let's go over this line by line, shall we? Now, this is actually, after I looked at it, I didn't have time to go fix it, but I looked at it and realized there's actually stuff missing in this. This is not even all of it. This is the old school way of configuring Spring Social in Spring Social 1.0. And as I said, I looked at it and I realized there's two things missing here. Well, the main thing that's missing is I don't have the API bindings and I don't have the connection repository bean. Those are actually being hidden by some other configuration I have here. And I pulled this from a example that was in transition from the old way to the new way. I should have gone even further back in GitHub when I found this. So there's actually more here than what you see. How many here are big fans of configuring with XML? You love it. Okay, this guy back here, that's it. We have one person who likes configuring with XML. If you like configuring with XML, even if you do, I hope you don't like configuring with lots of XML. So one of the other things that came along in Spring Social 1.1 was the ability to use these different namespaces. This is still a little hard to read because of the size of the font, and largely the biggest chunk of it is me just getting those namespaces pulled in. But what I have here is I have a handful of social-oriented namespaces, some for setting up the connection factories, some for setting up Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn individually. I'm not going to go over this. because again, I'm not a big fan of the XML config, but if you like using XML config, you can take a closer look at this slide later and see how you might do this. And by the way, this is also, the code that I pulled from is also in GitHub under the Spring Social samples. I'll share that with you later. Spring Social 1.1 also introduced a Java configuration approach, and this is pretty much it. I do an enable social. Among other things, that gives me these connection repositories, and it deals with the fact that some of them need to be bean scoped. It gives me this method I can override in social configurer where I can add the connection repositories. So here I'm simply adding the Twitter connection repository. I'm not adding everything here. Simply by adding the Twitter connection factory, not repository. By simply adding the Twitter connection factory, that's telling Spring Social under the covers a lot of things. It means you want to work with Twitter. Therefore, I probably should go ahead and configure that bean scoped Twitter API binding for you. You don't have to do it anymore. That's going to do it for you. And what I'm giving it here when I do that is the properties twitter.appkey and twitter.appsecret. These are the things you had got from Twitter when you register your application. I'm getting them from the environment because you don't want to hard code that stuff here. That's probably in a properties file or something, somewhere else. And then I have my user ID source. I have to have some way of figuring out who the user ID is here. Now in this case, I've gone ahead and shown you the gory details of it. I also have a Spring Security specific implementation of this so that this code could be even shorter. But you could see the details here. I'm actually just using Spring Security context holder to get the context. From that, get the authentication, and that's going to be able to uniquely identify my user. And I use that behind the scenes here. So a lot of the stuff I showed you previously on the last few slides is just gone here. It's handled for you. You've enabled social, therefore you're going to get a user's connection repository, user's connection repository. You've given me a user ID source, therefore I know that using that I can produce a connection repository for the given user. You've given me a Twitter connection factory. Well, among other things, that gives me a Twitter connection factory, but it also tells me that you probably want to use Twitter somewhere in your application. So I'm also going to create that Twitter API binding for you. And so it's all set up now. There's not much else to do. Yeah, there's other stuff. There's going to be a data, you're going to need a data source so that, configured elsewhere, so that this stuff can be stored in the database. But you don't have, that has nothing directly to do with social, so I've left it off of here. But even then, here's some, I guess I forgot about this slide. Here's a little bit more of the configuration. Here's the ConnectController that you've added. And then finally, here's the provider sign-in controller, which is, you configure a lot like the ConnectController. But even then, really, none of that is really necessary. It was nice, and it's good that you know how to do it, but it's not really that necessary. Thanks to work I've done recently, fairly recently in Spring Boot. So with that, let me just show you this example here, but I'm not going to show you on the slide because the slide's boring. Let me show you the real code. Let's see, what did I call it? Actually, I'm in the wrong folder. There we go. All right, let me see if I can get this so you guys can see it. That is a complete Spring Social application. Now, the guys on the Spring Boot team and some of the other teams that work with Spring Boot, they like to be really proud of the fact that they can write code that's small, that can be tweeted. This is the smallest Spring Boot app I've seen ever, not just social. I've not seen a shorter one than this. Now, it's not going to get you any awards at work. You're not going to get a raise for writing this code, okay? But it will work. So let me show you. Let me see if I can get this so you can see better what I'm doing. I usually zoom in before the talk starts, but I failed to do that today. All right, there we go. Let's run this. Just as you would any other Spring Boot application, it fires up, stuff happens, it gets pretty exciting, and you see started application. So let me go find Safari here. And we'll go to localhost 8080/, and here's where we go to the ConnectController, connect/Twitter. You can see I'm playing with some stuff there in the history, but connect/Twitter. hey, look, there's that boring Times Roman black on white background default view, connection status view. And it's saying you aren't connected to Twitter yet. Click the button. Okay, sure, I'll do that. It's going to redirect to Twitter, where I believe I may, yes, I'm already signed in there. And so I'm just going to go ahead and authorize the app, and it's going to redirect me back. Hello, Craig Walls. It never knew that my name was Craig Walls. It got that information by asking Twitter who I am. Once I've authorized it, now it can ask questions about my profile on Twitter, and it knows about me. Now, the only gotcha about that is even though that's nice and minimal, it's not very practical. You're not going to write real apps like that. So let me show you a slightly more interesting one. There you go. That's a little bit longer, and yet I think I can still tweet that. And all this is going to do is not make me go actually know what the URL is when I run it. I'll be happy to. Give me 1 second. So again, I didn't have to actually give it that URL. The redirect did it for me. That's all it added to it, but still, there's the code for it. And again, you're probably going to do more with your application than this. You're probably going to take that Twitter object and use it. But let me break it down and tell you what's going on here. And it's easier to describe by looking at the simpler version. What I could have done here, and it would have also have worked, it just wouldn't have been as short, is I could have used a grab annotation to go fetch Spring Social Twitter and add it to the class path. And the same thing would have worked. Instead, however, I just ask it to use Twitter. And by virtue of the fact that I'm using Twitter, even though I'm not doing anything with it, by virtue of the fact that this class references the Twitter type, which is, by the way, the interface behind which is the API binding to Twitter, by virtue of the fact that I'm referencing it, the Spring Boot CLI says, huh, it looks like you're using Twitter. Let me go add Spring Social Twitter to the class path. Now that Spring Social Twitter is on the class path, and also Spring Social Core for that matter, suddenly Spring Boot auto configuration kicks in and says, oh, it looks like Spring, in fact, I think I have slides that will walk me through this so I don't skip a step. It sees that we're using Twitter, it adds Spring Social and Spring Social Twitter to the class path. Now that's on there, it adds a ConnectController because Spring Social is on the class path. It sees that Spring Security is not on the class path. And so it configures a rather useless but practical in this situation, an anonymous implementation of user ID source. Essentially, it's an implementation of user ID source that doesn't try to figure out who the user is. It just assumes that there's only one user and that user's ID is anonymous. Again, not the kind of thing you want to keep. You're going to want to configure something different than this, but this will get you started. It sees that Spring Social Twitter is on the class path. Therefore, it configures a Twitter connection factory and a request scope Twitter API binding bean. And it sees that in the properties file, which I haven't shown you yet, but I will in a second, there's a Spring Social auto connection views set. And therefore, it configures that generic, boring Times Roman black on white background connection view for me. So just, again, I can show you this just as well. Here, here's the application.properties file. It has in it that auto configuration views, just so the boring auto configuration, the configuration view will be shown. And it has my Twitter app ID and secret. Now, I don't count these as lines of code. And the reason I don't count them as lines of code is because it's a properties file. And if you're familiar with how Spring Boot resolves properties, it doesn't have to resolve them from a properties file. I could have set these in my environment, and it would have also used them. I could have set these in YAML, for that matter, and it could have used them. So these don't count as lines of code, even though that's, you might think of them that way. Really, this is really the only line of code in that entire application I just ran. But again, you're probably not going to get any rewards for that. We're going to need to write something more interesting than that to actually take full advantage of Spring Social, but that's a good start. All right, where are we at? There's other stuff that Spring Boot and Spring Social work together to do if the stuff is available. It will configure a provider sign-in controller for you, assuming that there is a sign-in adapter being configured. So you have to have, assuming that there is a sign-in adapter and assuming that you have not otherwise configured provider sign-in controller yourself, it will configure one for you. Now, here's the gotcha on that. The one thing it doesn't do really well is it does not configure social authentication filter yet. This was like my step one. I wanted to get at least this much in before a certain Spring Boot release was cut. And so I didn't get the social authentication filter auto configuration set up in that. But it does give you provider sign-in support via provider sign-in controller if you configure a sign-in adapter, which could be a Spring Security based one. What I want to do going forward is I want to go revisit this and make it decide whether to use provider sign-in controller or to use social authentication filter, depending on whether Spring Social is available or not. But right now, you're kind of on your own there. It's gonna, if you want it to do something other than provider sign-in controller. It will configure connect interceptors and disconnect interceptors. I didn't talk about this earlier, but it's worth mentioning. Whenever you're working with ConnectController, whenever a connection is created, it will look for any ConnectController or connect interceptors that have been registered with ConnectController, and it will call those. It gives you an opportunity to do something with that connection while the connection is being established. When I show you another example here in a minute, you'll see one of those in action, where what will happen is as I make the connection, it will go ahead and tweet, hey, Craig connected to Spring Social Showcase or something like that. It'll just automatically turn around and tweet after the connection is made. Likewise, there's disconnect controller. So after a connection goes away, we can do something with that. Well, to do that with Spring Boot, all you have to do is configure beans that are of type connect interceptor or disconnect interceptor. The Spring Boot auto configuration will see those and make sure that ConnectController is given those beans. For provider sign-in controller, we have interceptors as well. So during the sign-in process, there's maybe some things you want to do during sign-in that are different than what you might do during a connection. And so again, just like with the connect and disconnect interceptors, if you have any beans of type provider sign-in interceptor, those are going to be configured with provider sign-in controller. It will, as I mentioned, it will configure a very basic Spring Security user ID source if Spring Security is on the class path. If Spring Security is not on the class path, it's going to configure the anonymous user ID source. And this is the one bullet that I aim to change in the future, where it's not even going to do that much. It's going to go use social authentication filter instead. And then finally, if timeleaf is on your class path, it's going to configure Spring Social's timeleaf dialect. So Spring Social has a JSP tag library for very simple operations like, am I connected to Twitter? If so, render this content. If not, don't render this content. Likewise, there's a timeleaf dialect that was introduced in Spring Social 1.1. The timeleaf dialect does the same kind of stuff. If we are connected to Twitter, render this. If we're not, don't render this type stuff. So if timeleaf is on your class path, the dialect is already registered for you as well. So let's talk about Spring Social Showcase. Now this is an example that I've been using for the past 4 years. This version of it I'm going to show you is different though. So let me run it first. It's always more fun to see it in action. And then we'll walk through and I'll show you some of the highlights of the code. So I've already compiled it. It's already ready to go here. I'm just going to do a java-jar build slib / Spring Social Showcase war file. So this is not interesting, so that's why I didn't make the fonts any bigger. I just want to make sure it gets started good. All right. Looks like it did. Good news. Sometimes I worry about that in live demos. Yes, we're doing good. All right, so here's the Spring Social Showcase. And it has built into it a handful of users that you can go ahead and log in as. I'm going to go ahead and log in as myself just to show you what happens. So, big deal. Spring Security is used to do that, but it has nothing to do with Spring Social yet. But I can go to the connections status, and you can see I'm not connected to anything. But if I were to go to Twitter and say connect with Twitter, actually, you know what I should have done? I'm going to tell it to post a tweet after I do this. So let's go ahead and connect with Twitter. We're going to go ahead and authorize the app. It's going to redirect back. You can see if you look really closely on the URL, there's a token and a verifier up there. And look, it just connected me. And now I have other options because, thanks to the time leaf dialect, I know I'm connected to Twitter, so it's showing me some more options down there I can do. Among those, I can view my profile. Big deal. There's my profile. Here's my timeline, and this should be interesting because the last thing on there is I've connected with Spring Social Showcase. That worked because I checked that little box. That's a Connect interceptor doing its job. That's the Connect interceptor saying, oh yeah, I wrote my own implementation of Connect interceptor that's part of the Showcase example. It's going to tweet that whenever somebody connects through it.
So you wrote all this chase piece also, or this was all out of the box?
No. This is the Showcase. I mean, yes, I wrote it, but it's none of what you see here from a view perspective is provided by Spring Social. It's just, the only thing that Spring Social offers as a view is that really boring Times Roman black on white background, which I'm not using at all here. All right. Looks like we have some other tweets going on about S2GX, so that's pretty exciting. In fact, let's try searching. One of the things we can do is we can search for S2GX. It's going to show me that. So it looks like there's some good stuff. Everybody's just retweeting the same thing that other people have written. So we can post a tweet. So tweeting from my Spring Social Prezzo at S2GX. We'll post the tweet. I don't know what's going on in the search box. There's something goofy there, so kind of ignore that. I'll figure that out later. Just pretend you didn't see that. So I don't know why it went back here, but we'll go back to our timeline. We'll see what's going on. Look, it looks like it tweeted it. And in fact, if we go to Twitter, just to prove to you that we're not faking this in any way, which would be tempting to do, I suppose, you can see, there we are. Pardon? Yeah, check it out yourself. It's awesome. Of course, I can go see who my friends are. Lots of friends here. I can go see who my followers are. I can go see what direct messages I have. Probably none of your business. So we'll go here. You can see what the trending topics are, and I apologize if anything offensive shows up here. That happens from time to time in the trending. It's not my fault. It's what the vast majority of Twitter users are doing. And here's another interesting thing I can do. I added this after Spring Social 1.1 to simulate a token being revoked. Now, I could go to Twitter and I could revoke the token. And that's just a lot of extra work to do that. What I've got here is a sim revoked, and what it does is it throws the same exception that you would get if the token didn't work. And so what essentially that does is it gives me an error. This is fantastic. I'm glad you saw this. I love live demos when things like that happen. It was supposed to go back to the home page and tell me that something bad happened. I guess I haven't got that part quite sorted out in this version of the code. In the old version where I actually have configuration in play, it works fine, but I really wish now I hadn't shown you that. So, oh well. So I could go, you can see I'm not connected to Facebook. You can see I am connected to Twitter because that didn't work. Here's what I can do though. I can go ahead and log out. And now that I've got a connection with Twitter, I can go click on sign in with Twitter, which is going to go through the same flow as ConnectController, but since I'm already signed in to Twitter, it's going to just redirect me back, and now I'm signed in here. I didn't have to explicitly enter my username and password. It just signed me in here.
One other question. So this user profile, timeline, friends, and all those things, this is coming out of the box.
Yes.
Methods where you can get all the information.
Yes, the question is, if all these abilities, these things I'm asking for, the timeline, the friends, and all that, is this stuff that Spring Social offers? Yes, there's what's going to happen. I'll show you the code here in a second, but what's happened is I'm injecting a Twitter object in, and from the Twitter object, I can make calls to get this information. You could do this also with REST template directly. If you wanted to just go get a REST template, you could do this. The gotcha is you got to make sure that authorization header is there on every single request. And since Twitter is OAuth 1 based, that's a big pain in the butt. Yep. So you don't want to do it.
Yeah, no, I've been using a lot of JavaScript to do all these things, and now it makes sense. Now I'm seeing what's the benefit of using social rather than using.
Yeah, and there's using JavaScript to do these things. There's a good time and place for that. There's certain scenarios where using JavaScript is a good idea. But in this case, you know, there's a lot of times when you want to actually get the stuff, potentially once you have an access token, there's no reason the user even has to be active for you to use that token. You could go make these requests when they're offline and find out things about them. As long as the token's good and they haven't revoked it, you could do stuff for them behind the scenes. This is kind of one of those things like, trying to think of an example, Hootsuite. Now Hootsuite's not built on Spring Social as far as I know, but if they were, there's no reason why they couldn't behind the scenes post things for me on a certain time, even though I'm not actively logged into them. So that's an example of how you could do that. You couldn't do that with JavaScript because you have to have the app there. It has to be running in the browser for it to work. So let me go ahead and sign out again. Let me show you another example. I'm going to sign in with Facebook. You notice I haven't created a connection with Facebook yet. That's all right. We'll go ahead and sign in with Facebook. Once again, I'm going to apologize for anything you might see on my timeline that my friends may have written. Most of them are respectful, but I know a few who might be iffy. So I apologize in advance for anything you might see. So I'm going to go ahead and log in to Facebook. Fantastic. I forgot my password. Let's try this again. This would be embarrassing if I don't know my Facebook password. Actually, you know what? I think I changed it back during the big scare on people stealing passwords. Looks like we might be good now. Okay, I did not have a connection to Facebook. Therefore, it couldn't log me in. So it took me to the registration page. But it pre-populated the registration page with information about the user. It told me my first name and my last name. And up until recently, it would also give you your username. Unfortunately, Facebook's API has gone through a transition over the last several months from Facebook API 1.0 to Facebook API 2.0. And 2.0, users don't have usernames anymore. That's a concept that went away. Well, I think they still do, but you can't get them very easily. So I can't do that in the API anymore. But it populates as much as it knows about me. As much as it can possibly gather about me, it populates that in the form for me. So all I have to do is fill out the rest. So this is going to be, since I already have a Habuma user, I'll do a Habuma 2. And my password will be super secret password. And now I'm signed in. You can see my user profile. Notice it's not showing me that I'm connected to Twitter because this is a different user. You can see my user profile. You can see my feed. Again, I apologize if you see anything questionable. You see my friends. This is my chance for all my friends who have not come to this conference to be famous if they ever see, oh, well, crap, that's not working. Oh, you know why that's not working? Same reason as the sim expired. I was faking it out so I could test something and I never fixed it. Ignore that. So let's go back to, let's disconnect here, sign out. And you can do the same thing with LinkedIn. You can do the same thing with whoever. So even though Facebook and even though Twitter offer sign-in through their JavaScript APIs, everybody who offers an API with OAuth security can be used as your sign-in opportunity here. All right, did I show you everything that's in there? Yes, I think I did. Let's go look at the code for it.
So is it easy enough to like auto-register with Spring Social? Like when you go sign in with Facebook and you sign in on Facebook and it pitches back and says you're not a user yet, can you just have it auto-register you?
Yes, okay, the question is, rather than when you sign in with Facebook and it doesn't find a connection and it throws me to the registration page, is there a way so that you don't even see the registration page, so it automatically registers you? Yes and no. It depends on what you mean by registration at that point. If you mean actually register the user into your user database, the answer is theoretically it could be done, but it's not really a good idea because you don't know what you want their user ID to be locally. You don't know what their password should be locally. You still need to ask them those kinds of questions. But the other option you have is what's known as implicit registration, where you don't necessarily maintain a user database locally. Facebook is your user database. And so as far as you're concerned, they're logged in and anything you know about that user is now, you're going to go fetch from Facebook. Yes, there is a way of doing that. Through one of the connection repositories, you essentially tell it you're wanting to do implicit sign up. And that's exactly what happens. They will now be authenticated into your application, but it will not bother with registering them. Their Facebook identity is their identity on your app as well. It's just a flag, it's just a setting and configuration to do that. I'm not sure if the boot configuration supports that yet. That's something I probably need to put on my to-do list. And if I did do that, it would probably just be simply a property you set to enable it. So looking at the code, I'm going to hit some of the highlights of the code so you can see what happened. What's interesting about this example is I actually wrote this example several months ago. And then I was busy with other activities in the time since then. And so the other day I thought I'd pull this back up once again and refamiliarize myself with it so that I could talk to you guys about it intelligently. And so I asked myself, where is the social configuration file? So let me go look at how the Spring Social stuff is configured. So I started digging around in here, and I came to the config folder, and there's not a social configuration class. There's not a social config.java class. And my first thought was, what the crap? Where is it? How does this even work? Because I was on some cold medicine and I was really tired, and it didn't occur to me until a few seconds later, oh yeah, Spring Boot's doing all of that. There is no social configuration. It's automatic. Because if you go to my build file, Spring Social and Spring Social Twitter and Spring Social Facebook and Spring Social LinkedIn are on the class path. And because in my, where's it at? In my application of properties, I have these things set up. Therefore, because they're on the class path and because I've identified their application keys and secrets, everything I needed was registered. Which, by the way, is why the reconnect controller didn't work, is because the Spring Boot configuration does not know about reconnect controller. That's something else that's on my to-do list. It does not know to configure that one automatically for me. So I would have had to explicitly configure it to make it work. And since there is no explicit configuration, well, it's just not there. That's it. That's pretty darn cool when you think about it. This is all the configuration you need. Now, how do you use it? Once you got it, how do you use it? Well, down here, I've got several controllers, like the one that shows the Facebook feed. The Facebook feed is injected. Let me kind of zoom out a little bit so we can see more of it. The Facebook feed controller is injected through its constructor with a Facebook object. The Facebook object is then used to, among other things, go to the feed operations. So the Facebook itself is the API binding. Underneath that are several sub-API bindings, like the feed operation, the friends operation, things like that. So here we're dealing with the feed. So go to feed operations, get the feed. Essentially, go get the Facebook user's wall. Go get that information, put it into the model, and we're going to show that on the view. Likewise, down here, when we say update status, we're posting something to the wall. Kind of in a similar way, if you go to Twitter, let's see, how about the friends controller? In the Twitter friends controller, it's injected with Twitter. And because this Twitter bean, which I didn't configure, by the way, Spring Boot did, this Twitter bean is request scoped, it knows who the current user is, and therefore the Twitter object that's being given is not just the one everybody gets. It's getting a request scoped Twitter. And from that request scoped Twitter, it's asking, who are the friends? Well, you can't see that because it got cut off, but who are my friends? Who are my followers? Yeah. Do you have a question? Yeah, the scoping is being scoped. That's one of the reasons I did that. There's a couple of things that really bothered me about Spring Social 1.0 in that it worked really well. I mean, when you think about it, if you sit there and kind of analyze all the components of Spring Social, it was extremely well designed, and I can't take entire credit for that because there's another guy on the team who helped me come up with the design, and it was a pretty good design that we came up with, and I was pretty pleased with it. But good design does not necessarily lead to easy configuration in Spring. And in fact, in this case, because we had two connection repositories and because of the scoping you had to put on certain things, it was just kind of a nightmare to configure. And it was painful for me when I would present Spring Social to a group like this. It was painful for me to have to explain all that because there's so many things you have to get just right, otherwise it's not going to work. Well, not a problem. It worked because I crammed it down behind, first off, the Java configuration and XML configuration support in Spring Social 1.1, and then now with Spring Boot, you don't even know what's going on there. It's just there. It just works because I've asked it to work. I've asked for Twitter to be available. One other thing I'll show you. Let's see. Down, you know, when I connected with Twitter and I checked that little box and said, be sure and tell my friends about the fact that I'm connecting with Spring Social. The reason that worked is because I have a tweet after connect interceptor. So that's all. Let me kind of zoom out a little bit more so we can see it all. For pre-connect, all it's going to do is check to see if in fact that the checkbox was checked, and if so, it's going to set an attribute so that we remember to do this once we come back from the redirect from Twitter. And then once we come back and we've created the connection, I've connected with Spring Social Showcase. It's going to go to the connection. It's going to call update status. It's going to tweet that for me. So all that works. The reason it got configured with ConnectController, in the old days, you would have had to explicitly, when you created ConnectController, go set the connect interceptors property yourself. But since I have no Spring Social configuration in this app, I don't explicitly do that. All I did is I just annotated it with component. It gets picked up by the component scanner. It becomes a bean. And now that it's a bean, Spring Boot sees it and makes sure that ConnectController gets told about it. Yes?
Can you use ordered on that? Or if you have multiple interceptors, is it indeterminate order?
Can you use order on that? Actually, you know what? I don't. That's a good question. In the original version of this, when it configured with ConnectController, you kind of were in charge of the ordering because you gave it a list of these things. With the boot configuration, you know what? I think it's indeterminate. That's a good point. I need to probably address that. This is what's awesome about presenting this stuff is you're creating bugs for me and creating new improvements for me. Well, you're creating new issues for me to resolve. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure I don't deal with ordering, and I probably should. Good point. Thank you. Well, let's move on because it's getting close to lunchtime. Some final thoughts on this. Here's where we're at today. Earlier this year, I cut the Spring Social 1.1.0 release, which along with it drug along Facebook, Twitter 1.1.0 release, and we finally released LinkedIn 1.0.0 release. Notice, even though they've been kind of carrying each other along throughout this life cycle, as far as the same version numbers are concerned, the versioning is designed so that I don't have to release everything in order to maybe fix something in Facebook. And I don't really have to release everything to fix something in Core. They've been historically kind of been going neck and neck with each other, but it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, thanks to Facebook, who, I kid you not, days after I cut the 1.1 release, decided they were going to change their API, I suddenly found myself needing to cut another Facebook release because their API is changing and because it introduces breaking changes. Things that used to work in Spring Social that just can't work anymore because Facebook won't support them anymore. I needed to actually go ahead and make the jump to 2.0. So there is a 2.0 milestone 1 out there that has the Facebook 2.0 API in it. If you're using 1.1, you're using their old 1.0 API. If you're using 2.0, you're using their 2.0 API. By the way, this has nothing to do with Spring Social. It's just you need to know this. If you go register your application today with Facebook and you want to create a brand new application, you're going to use 2.0 whether you want to or not. Even if you try to use our old implementation, you're still going to be using the 2.0 API and things may or may not work right. So you want to use the 2.0 version. That's why I found myself in a situation where I had to go ahead and get started on 2.0 because new applications will have no choice. If your application was registered with Facebook prior to, I think it was April 30th, then you have a choice. And it depends largely on how the URL is structured when you make the call. And so in that case, you have a choice at least until April 30th of 2015, at which point you're out of luck. You have to be on 2.0 now. So you have a year to work that out. LinkedIn is also a 1.0. A 1.0 release was cut at the same time as all these others. It has since had a slight bug fix release, so 1.0.1 release. And then GitHub is the one project that has been largely ignored, although being used heavily. I know a few people who have been asking lots of questions about it lately, and it is used as at least somewhat used within Spring.io. Our website uses Spring Social GitHub. It needs to be finished. There's not much left to be done with it. It just needs to be finished. It needs to go through some final testing, maybe some revisions of the API binding to make sure we're all caught up with the latest API. And right now there is no Spring Boot auto configuration for GitHub, so that needs to be addressed. But once we get that dealt with, we can call GitHub, Spring Social GitHub 1.0 a good release in release status. So what's next? Oh, I can't promise you that any of this is going to get done in the near future, but this is the things that I've identified are things that, some of the high-level things I'd like to get done. I'd like to make sure that that social authentication filter works with Spring Boot so you don't have to use provider sign-in controller. That's a given. I really wanted to do that in the beginning. I just ran out of time before they cut the boot release that has it in there. Facebook API 2.0 binding, well, it's at milestone 1. I encourage you to try it out, give me feedback, tell me if something's not working. Let's get this sorted out so I can cut a release. I want to get the GitHub release dealt with as well as the Spring Boot support in there for it. There's some ideas that are in place for social sign-in, specifically the implicit sign-in that we talked about earlier. There's some areas where that could be improved and made even better. And so there's some thoughts there that I want to try to get worked out, because a lot of people want to be able to do that, where they don't have their own user store. They rely on the API that they're working with to be the user store. Spring for Android works really well with Spring Social right now, but unfortunately, Android being a weird little device to work with, it doesn't support everything very well. And Roy Clarkson, the project lead for Spring for Android, he's identified a few things for me that we need to work out, and it largely comes down to what are the dependencies that are being pulled in via Gradle or Maven. You can make it work, but you have to go explicitly remove some of the dependencies that will break if they're pulled in on Android. And so he and I are going to talk about how to get that dealt with. And then one of the biggest complaints, or I wouldn't say complaint, it's my complaint, but other people have helped me identify this, is that the reference documentation for Spring Social is pretty good, but it's not really a tutorial, and there's not really any good how do you build an application from the ground up using Spring Social, especially now that Spring Social and Spring Boot are working together. So at some point I really would like to put together a couple of tutorials, kind of the baseline, how do you build a baseline Spring Social application, how do you do implicit sign-in, how do you do some of those other things. So there's a few areas there where I think we could improve on the documentation. Here's how you can get involved. Some of you have already sort of done this by verbally telling me things that need to be done. But certainly go create issues. Go out to our Jira, go create issues, and here's all the different URLs for that. But essentially it's jira.spring.io/social, soc-fb, soc-twr, soc-li, and social GitHub or GH. Ask and answer questions. We're using Stack Overflow for our forums right now, and there's lots of good questions out there. I don't have necessarily the time or bandwidth to answer all of those quickly. I try to, but I can't guarantee any sort of timely response. I really appreciate the Stack Overflow community who's come in and helped me answer some of those questions, so I'm not having to be the one guy who has to deal with this every day. So please help me answer the questions. But if you have questions, ask the questions. That would be, by asking questions, you help us identify what else needs to be done. Fix and, fork the projects, fix the bugs, submit pull requests, help me out. This is an open source project after all, and I would love it if you guys would contribute. It's a great opportunity to maybe have a little open source contribution on your resume. Just help me sort out some of the issues. If you see a problem, report it, but even better, fix it, and help me sort these things out. And finally, as I said earlier, there's 28 projects out there who have extended where Spring Social reaches into. I don't have the bandwidth, I barely have the bandwidth to deal with Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and GitHub. I certainly don't have it for all the APIs out there. So if you see an API out there, maybe it's one of these that the original author has sort of dropped the ball on, or maybe it's something that's not up here. This is an opportunity for you to step in. Your project can go here. Tell me about it. I will tweet the crap out of that thing. I will let everybody know about it. And because, especially if it's on GitHub, you have an opportunity to have everyone else in this room and everyone else who follows this on Twitter to find out about that project, and maybe they can help you sort that out and help you work on your project. And that's it. I'm done. It's lunchtime. Here's where you can find out about Spring Social and all the various locations. Follow us on Twitter. Like us on Facebook. Thank you very much. Yes?
Question for you. So if you go back a slide. So you mentioned that Spring Social was able to support the Mac tokens for OAuth 2. So how does Intuit handle that situation?
I gotta be honest, I have no idea. I believe that they are using bearer tokens, and I think that's horrible. But it's not my call. I don't know. Again, that's a community project. I've barely looked at it. I know the guy I sort of know the guy who's worked on it. We've met in person, talked, but I'm thinking it's bearer tokens, which, as I said, I'm dead set against using bearer tokens for that kind of information. But it wasn't my call either, so. Actually, our reference, if the question is if there's another API and you want to actually build an API binding or build connection support, how do you get started? There's actually, our reference documentation has a chapter specifically on how to do that. It tells you how to do it. There's actually 2 steps. There's 2 main steps. One is the boring but easy one, and the other is the very time-consuming but necessary. You have to create an API binding. And there's no way I can help you with that. You have to know the API. You have to kind of maybe look at some of the examples that are already out there and kind of follow suit and do the same kinds of things. That's easy to do. It's going to take you forever to get it done, especially if the API is large. But the other part that's easy to do and critical, and will take you like 5 minutes, is go create the connect support for you. So you have to go create a connection factory. You have to go create a service provider class. There's another class whose name escapes me right now. There's basically three or four things you have to create, and they're all embarrassingly boilerplate. I mean, it will take you no time at all to create them. You'll be done in 5 minutes. And then you can spend all the rest of your time on the API binding. But these other little boring pieces, these are what make ConnectController work with your API. And then once you have the API binding, you can start making calls to the API.
So is it safe to say that it's better to use Spring Social whenever you need to read something from someone's profile? Whenever you have to post, whenever you have to do anything else, you should use JavaScript APIs for those things?
So the question is it safer to use Spring Social for reading, but maybe use JavaScript for posting?
Not safer.
Or
what I'm saying
a better choice?
Better choice. And the reason behind it is because when you use JavaScript API, it provides you out-of-the-box presentation layer, which you can directly add to your
Sure. And the answer is I don't think that that's the deciding factor. I think it comes down to what is it your app's trying to do. And again, there are certain situations where you're going to want to let the server do the posting and potentially the reading. And so it kind of depends on the app's needs. I'm not going to say anything bad about the JavaScript libraries. There's a time and place for those. But they don't fit every use case. And I don't know what the line is that's drawn. It really just depends on your application. And you have to kind of make an intelligent decision on whether you're better off using a server-side call or using a client-side call.
Does it do anything with regard to the API rate limits?
Does it do anything with regard to the rate limits? Yes and no. It doesn't deal with them, but it will recognize them and throw a rate limit exception. And then it's up to you to figure out what you're going to do about that. Because again, that's not really a standard answer. It kind of depends on what your app wants to do in that circumstance.
If I were to use this in an offline data collection process sort of thing where like I would use Spring Social and all the APIs, what support do you have currently have where, because I need to maintain some state information like tokens associated with the user and some state information, what support do you have currently?
What's a what?
What support do you have currently?
So the question is, if you want to do this for offline data collection or whatever, what support do we have? Ultimately, I don't have any support directly for that problem, but there's certainly, the connections are stored in the database. The user doesn't have to be signed in or even using the app to go fetch those connections from the database. Once you have the connection, you can get the API binding. At that point, you just have to know who your users are, because typically when you're injecting an API binding, you're doing it based on who the current user is. But it doesn't mean you can't go fetch a connection from the repository if you can somehow just say, hey, give me all the connections from the repository, or go give me Craig's connection from the repository if you know my ID. You can always go fetch that connection, and from that get Craig's API binding and make calls on Craig's behalf, even if Craig's not around.
Is the database like a configurable thing that I can
Is the database configurable? Right now, well, it's an interface. So there's users connection repository and connection repository. There are out of the box JDBC implementations for that. And it's depending on the table to look a certain way. So as long as the table has these columns, you're okay. I tried to make it more flexible, but it got really messy really quick, because the amount of data that's kept in that table, as far as the number of columns, trying to customize that became a nightmare. So I decided, no, there's no harm in you making the table look like this. If you don't like the way the table looks, you can always go create your own implementation of the connection repository. If you want to use JPA, there is third-party JPA support. I don't think I ever merged it. It may actually be part of Spring Social now. At one time I considered merging it in, and I don't remember if I did or not. So if it's in the Java doc, yes, I did. But if not, there is another third party. Somebody has gone off, one of the community processes, they've gone off and added that. I want to personally, for my own personal needs, I have a little toy project I've been working on. I want to add Neo4j support so I can store these connections as nodes in a graph. And then also Mongo. I see a potential for using Mongo support for storing these things. Also Redis. Redis would be a perfect place to store these kinds of things. I just, out of the box, we just have JDBC.
For Twitter, do you have or already have plans for the Twitter stream APIs that are?
Yeah, there is, the question is, do we have support for or do we have plans for the Twitter streaming APIs? Yeah, as of Spring Social Twitter 1.1, we have a streaming, go twitter.streamingoperations. Whatever, and you give it a stream handler, and it gets called whenever stuff shows up.
So do you have the group streaming as well?
It supports all of the streams. However, if you're familiar with streaming, some of those aren't necessarily practical for most people, or even allowed for all applications. Even though I support them in the sense that I've written code that I believe work with them, but since my application did not fit the criteria for them to approve me to use it, I'm only assuming it works. Yeah.
So you will consume whatever they give you.
I will consume it if they give me what I think they're going to give me. If I'm wrong about that, then somebody needs to open a bug issue with me and let me know. But I'm basing that entirely on my experience with the other streams and based on their documentation, not on my actual ability to actually try it out, because they won't approve me to do that. So.
Any support for the Firehose?
That is actually, yes. All the streams are there, including Firehose.
Are you able to connect like multiple accounts, like say multiple Twitter accounts for one user?
Yes. The question is, can you connect multiple Twitter accounts for one user? Yes. It's not the most common use case, and so there's not a lot of examples out there that show that. At one time, Spring Social Showcase actually showed how to do that, but for a variety of reasons, it was confusing people. People who didn't care about that use case were being confused. And so I took it out. I need to probably bake up an example that shows how to do that. That may be one of those guides or tutorial things I end up making to show that. But right now I don't have any examples handy to show that. But yes, you can. What else?
Do you know, are you planning on adding Facebook Ads API?
Am I planning on adding Facebook Ads API? There's no direct plans on that. It's one of those, yeah, we might do it someday. I'm really kind of hoping that somebody in the community will step up and deal with that, because it's not really a high priority for me. But certainly if you're looking to do something, I'll accept pull requests. But anything else? All right, thank you very much.